In the modern world, we take science to be more or less the default approach to answering any question. Obviously, with fields of study like physics or biology, we see that these questions are best answered by the scientific method. But more and more we see that science is being applied to things that weren't typically in the purview of science. And more we're seeing that in every field, regardless of whether it historically fell under the purview of science or not, science is being used as the chief tool to answer these questions. Of course, many of these science-based answers have great practical use. Science has often borne great fruit in these fields. At the same time, it does seem that there are some fields that science has been applied to where it seems to offer an incomplete or even incorrect answer. You'll see today some people try to use science as a means to explain something like beauty or love. They'll say that beauty or love are just based on a certain phenomenon of chemicals in the brain, a certain sort of neurological interaction or something. And it's hard to look at these answers without thinking they are somewhat reductive. Now, what is it about the scientific and quantitative approach that makes these so reductive? What is it that makes it seem that this doesn't really capture everything about these questions? Perhaps the most common place where we see this sort of attempt to scientifically answer a seemingly unscientific question is in questions of happiness and unhappiness. We see time and time again people attempt to apply principles of science and experimental methods to try and understand what it is that makes humans unhappy or happy and what it is that might make us happier. How can we practically apply this scientific data to our real lives? Now, this will often be seen in things like supposedly science-backed habits of happiness or certain science-backed understandings of the human mind that are meant to lead to greater happiness. Again, there's obviously a great deal of truth to these things. It's clear when we talk about, for instance, the brain chemistry of happiness that we are talking about something that is true and real about human happiness. There is this real phenomenon associated with it. The problem begins when we begin to think that science is the only way to approach these questions. Let's talk a bit about the scientific method and exactly what it is that it does. Any scientist would tell you that science fundamentally only studies physical things and phenomena. Everything it studies has to be something that's reducible to a physical object or somehow deterministic in nature. Science is about trying to infer natural laws to explain why nature acts a certain way or to predict how it will act in the future. We take these physical things that are clearly subject to natural law and we try to make uniform scientific laws about how they will act in the future. Clearly, this makes science great at studying things like chemistry or physics, where it seems that everything that we study is purely material or purely determined. Everything there can fall under a certain consumption of laws. We can easily predict what's going to happen. We can easily explain what has previously happened purely through this deterministic vision of the world. So, it seems that the scientific method has to deal with these material things and has to deal with them in a deterministic way. It has to purely act upon this study of physical cause and effect. Now, let's ask ourselves, if it's the case that science can only study these things, what does it mean when we use science to study happiness or other things outside of the normal scope of science? Let's go back to the concept of beauty, which we talked about earlier. Let's say we want to figure out what makes a painting beautiful. That's obviously a hard question to ask. It's hard to say what it is that, first of all, beauty is. It's hard to say what the experience of beauty is. Now, when we take a scientific approach to this, perhaps we could quantify certain reactions in the brain. We could say, well, a certain neurological phenomenon was observed, or a certain sort of brain chemistry was observed. We could also try to quantify the painting itself. We could say, well, it has this and that aesthetic profile, this sort of color mixture, and so on. And we can try and find what it is that seems to be the most aesthetically pleasing to people. But it's clear that science really can't offer an answer for what makes a thing beautiful. Clearly, there's a great deal of subjectivity involved, a great deal of unpredictability. It's hard to make any sort of law-like conclusion about what it is that leads to something seeming beautiful, or what it is that makes someone feel as though something is beautiful. We can try to collect as much data as we want about what makes this painting beautiful, or what all beautiful paintings have in common, but it just doesn't seem that it will get at the answer of why it is beautiful. It seems there's something beyond this purely material, purely determined sort of phenomenon. It seems that we can't just reduce this to a series of natural laws that will determine what proceeds. Let's go back to happiness. When we try to answer these questions of happiness through purely the scientific method, we're approaching happiness essentially as a purely physical thing determined by natural laws. In the process, we're also saying something about human nature. Questions about happiness are fundamentally questions about human nature. What is good for a human? What does a human want? What is it that, as a person, will really fulfill you? Now, when we're asking those questions about human nature and saying that we can only ask them scientifically, what we are saying is fundamentally that human nature is something that is physical and guided by these natural laws, something that is fully predictable and determined. This leaves no room for something like free will or the human soul, things that for many people are essential to the notion of what a human is and to the notion of human dignity. This is not to say that there is no possible fruit to taking a scientific approach to happiness. Clearly, there are many ways in which this is a useful approach, many useful conclusions that it can lead us to. We have to be cautious. If we take exclusively this approach, then we risk reducing the human to nothing more than a physical object. We're saying that happiness is something like gravity or something like a certain chemical reaction. It's just determined. It's a simple product of nature. a simple interaction of atoms in one way or another. First of all, this might not seem to be commensurate to human dignity, but above all, it just does not seem to be a good way of answering these questions. It's clear that for all of our scientific understanding of the human person and how humans act, we simply don't have the tools or the knowledge to know or to predict how it is that humans will react to things in a perfect way. We simply don't have the scientific power to approach these problems purely through science. We need something beyond science. We simply cannot reduce them to this purely material and purely natural law governed perspective. There simply has to be something more. There has to be a greater insight into what human nature really is. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing, and if you're interested in further inquiries into these questions of happiness, please consider subscribing to our Substack, where we will have weekly articles on the same topic. Thank you.